This is an Atari 8-bit home computer, specifically the 130 XE. In the last episode, we upgraded this machine with the ultimate 1 megabyte expansion. Today, we'll be adding this Side 3 cartridge to the equation, then taking a look at some of the incredible things the Atari is capable of with these two upgrades working together in tandem. I'm still who I am, this is still what it is, so take it away, title screen. Previously on RetroBits, we desoldered the Atari's OS-ROM and MMU chips, installed sockets, and connected up the ultimate 1 megabyte. Let's start with a quick recap of the features that this upgrade brings to the table. Our ultimate expansion is using the FJC or Flash JazzCat firmware. This is a complete rewrite of the device's original software and introduces many new features beyond a simple RAM expansion. Some examples include a high-speed parallel bus interface, or PBI BIOS, real-time clock, stored configuration profiles, software expandability by way of plugins, and seamless integration with the Side 3 cartridge, as we'll see shortly. Speaking of which, here's the other half of the equation. Like the ultimate 1 megabyte, the Side 3 hardware was created by Candle, and the firmware was written by FJC. The device is, at its core, an SD card-based mass storage solution for the Atari. It supports multiple FAT16 and FAT32 partitions and hot swapping of media. It allows the user to quickly navigate the SD card's file systems and run executables directly from the built-in menu. The device can also emulate cartridges, multiple floppy drives, and even hard disks. Similar to the ultimate 1 megabyte, it has a built-in real-time clock and SpartaDOS X. As the name implies, the Side 3 represents the third generation of the product, and this latest iteration adds many new features, owing in part to big increases to the onboard ROM and RAM. Now let's get to the fun stuff and look at some of these features in action. First, let's boot up the machine. By pressing Help and Reset, we can enter the Ultimate's built-in menu system. In the System Information tab, we can see that our device shipped with firmware 4.05 and that it's currently configured to load the plugin for the Side 2, an earlier version of our cart. If we launch the loader, we should be presented with a directory of the SD card that was inserted into the Side 3. But because the correct plugin isn't yet loaded, the result is that the two devices aren't able to talk to each other yet. Let's exit the Ultimates menu and reboot. The cart's own loader screen appears, and now we can see the contents of our SD card. We can use this separate menu for now, but it'll be in our interest to get the two devices working together as a team. For the moment, let's just see what the Side 3 can do on its own. Here, I'll enable ATR disk image support. The cartridge by itself has rudimentary capabilities for handling these images without relying on the Ultimate expansion to be present at all. To demonstrate, I'll browse to a disk image and assign it to drive 1 with the Tab key. As an alternative, you could just hit Enter to launch the disk straight away. And just like that, we're into the game. Easy peasy. The Side 3 has a single button on the back. It can be used to swap between disks for software that require more than one, but it can also be configured to reset the state of the cartridge. Watch what happens when I press the reset button. The disk image stays mounted and the Atari boots right back into the game. Now, I'll activate the button on the Side 3 first. Resetting the machine now returns back to the loader instead, and we can choose something different to play. Very handy. While the first disk image we tried worked fine, there are others that don't fare as well. Some simply crash on boot, while others fail to load entirely. This is because, on its own, the Side 3 has limited ATR support. It implements a soft-loaded OS that gets shimmed into the Atari's memory space, so it's not highly compatible with all software. We'll revisit this issue again once we've updated the firmware. Something that does work really well is running executable programs straight from the card, such as this .xex file here. Within days of starting on this video, several new amazing demo scene productions came out for the Atari, both requiring a RAM expansion to run. Even without updating the ultimate firmware or plugins, software like this can still take full advantage of the 1 MB upgrade. Here's another new demo that requires the full megabyte of RAM. Like the one we just looked at, this is designed for a PAL system and doesn't run correctly on this NTSC hardware. Still, one can start to get an idea of the potential here. Yeah. Another Side 3 capability that works great right now is cartridge emulation. When you select a ROM image, the device attempts to auto-detect the type, but you can override the selection if you know better. In my testing, the default always worked fine for me. Modern, large format carts are also supported, such as this 1 MB Atari Max port of Space Harrier from 2018.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Can you even imagine how past you would have reacted if you saw something like this running on an Atari 8-bit back in the 80s? It never ceases to amaze me what modern coders have been able to squeeze out of these old systems.
Get ready. Get ready.
Alright, it's time to get this 130XE set up properly. In order to have the two upgrades fully integrate with each other, we'll need to make sure we're running the latest firmware and the correct plugins. Simply follow the links on the project website to atari8.co.uk where you'll find the download. Once the transfer is complete, extract the contents of the zip file onto your SD card. You'll also want to read the user manual, as there are quite a few steps to the process. I think it's interesting stuff, but feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter if you just want to see the hardware in action. Step 1. Make sure you're not booting into SpartaDOS X on the side 3 by placing the switch in the forward position. Step 2. Press Help and Reset to enter the Ultimate 1 MB menu. Ensure the 1088K Rambo option is enabled, the XL OS ROM is selected, and that the Ultimate's own SpartaDOS X, hereafter referred to as SDX, is enabled. Next, page over to the PBI BIOS and hard disk settings and disable the BIOS entirely. Remember to save your settings with the S key. Step 3. Cold boot the system using the menu option or by pressing C and enter the Side 3 loader menu. As we just enabled SDX, press the X key during the splash screen to skip loading the OS this one time. Now in the loader, enable the FAT file system handler. This will allow Atari software to access the SD card's working directory, albeit in read-only mode. We're also going to disable ATR support as we don't want the OS shim interfering with the updater. With that done, we'll power cycle the system and let it boot into SDX from the Ultimate 1MB card. This is a little bit roundabout, but now that we have SDX loaded in memory, we can use the car command to access the cartridge, which, of course, brings us back to the Side 3 loader. From there, we can navigate to the firmware updater on the SD card and run it. An alternative option would be to mount the firmware ATR image in a disk emulator of your choosing, such as the S drive or SIO to PC. If the updater does not detect your Ultimate expansion, do not proceed. Go back and double check that you followed all the required steps in the manual. The Ultimate's firmware is broken down into a variety of smaller pieces, and each can be updated or replaced individually. This includes SDX, a work-in-progress graphical OS, the main BIOS, plugins, the loader, as well as the OS-ROM, basic, and cartridge images when used in XEGS mode. We can also upgrade the individual parts all at once, which is what we'll do today. The firmware I've selected is specifically intended for use with the Side 3. A README file in the zip archive will help you choose the right firmware for your particular setup. Because of the number of options available, along with the use of acronyms and product names you may not be familiar with if you're a novice like me, updating the firmware can be a little confusing at first. My suggestion is to read the manual and then read it again. Then, Google anything you don't understand before proceeding. Once the process completes, we can power cycle the machine and press the Help button during the splash screen to enter the Ultimate's menu. Checking the system information again, we're still running version 4.05 of the firmware, but unlike before, we now have the Side 3 PBI BIOS and plugin installed. This combo will give us the seamless integration between the two devices we're looking for, as well as several new menu items to control the cartridge. Right, so let's test it out. What happens when we activate the loader from the Ultimate menu this time? Hey, look at that, it's no longer empty. The Ultimate detected the presence of the Side 3 and launched the correct loader instead of using its own built-in version. Next, we'll want to update the firmware on the cartridge as it shipped with an old version from 2020. This can be easily accomplished simply by running the updater straight from the SD card. Uh-oh, the Side 3 won't boot anymore. No matter what I try, I just get the self-test screen. Crap. So that's it for today. I bricked the Side 3. So now I can't show you any of the cool features I wanted to. Nah, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you guys. Or would I? Anyway, I panicked for a bit. Remember, this isn't my hardware. After scratching my head for a while, I remembered that I can also load XEX files from my own S-Drive Max. I copied the firmware updater to my own memory card, connected the S-Drive to the Atari as D1, selected the boot device, and breathed a sigh of relief. It looks like it's working. And there we go. The Side 3 is now up and running the latest software version. Catastrophe averted. For good measure, I also updated SpartaDOS X on the cartridge. I'll forgo showing that process in order to move things along. It's not really necessary anyway, as we'll be primarily running SDX from the Ultimate 1MB. I again use the S Drive Max here because the update ATR image must be mounted on something other than the Side 3 itself. With everything up to date, it's time to revisit ATR image support. Newfound synergies come in the guise of the Parallel Bus Interface BIOS, which we'll enable now, along with hard disk support. Note that this change will disable the selector switch on the Side 3, and the Atari's boot up behavior will be determined by the Ultimate's own configuration going forward. Let's try loading the same ATR disk image as before and see what happens this time. Awesome, we now have full ATR support on the Side 3 due to the PBI BIOS provided by the Ultimate. Another benefit of this direct access to the system bus is speed. Using the built-in search function, I'll type a few characters of the title I want to play and then hit enter. Just watch how fast this game loads. Since we've already got hard disk support enabled, let's check out how that works using the built-in SpartaDOS X. First, we need to change the startup configuration on the Ultimate. Remember, the switch on the Side 3 isn't active when the PBI hard disk is enabled. SDX, as the name implies, is a disk operating system for the Atari 8-bit home computer. It began life as a commercial product way back in 1987, but is now considered abandonware, and development of the OS has been continued by enthusiasts right up to the present day. The interface is modeled after MS-DOS, and many of the commands and syntax are the same. Of course, we haven't set up any drives yet, but we'll get to that. SDX boots and runs from ROM, and we can see all the programs, drivers, and configuration files that are part of the firmware by using this familiar dir command. Some of the commands and files are instantly recognizable, others are specific to the Atari. Just like with MS-DOS, we need to use the fdisk tool to partition our hard drives. First, we'll select the 32GB SD card that's inserted into the Side 3. If this is a new card, the software will prompt you to initialize it and warn you that the contents of the disk will be erased. Now, we can split the card up into two sections, the first being a FAT16 or FAT32 partition for the Side 3 loader, and the second for Atari native partitions. I'll disable autofill as I plan to create an additional FAT partition on the card later. I think 1GB each should be more than sufficient. On the next screen, we can add Atari native partitions inside the 1GB area we just created. The maximum size of each partition is 65,535 sectors, so we'll create a couple of those now. I'm going to name the partitions boot and data, for obvious reasons. Each partition will get a disk assignment. I'll use D2 for the first volume, so as to leave D1 free for any floppy drives we may want to connect or emulate. I'll also toggle the boot attribute for this one. Finally, I'll write the changes to the disk. Note that all the steps I performed can be done through the comprehensive menu interface, but the hotkeys for each task are intuitive. Now, we just have to format the partitions we created the same way we would using DOS on a PC. And just like that, we have 2 Atari hard drive partitions ready to be used. We're ready to format the FAT32 partition and copy some data over. On my PC, I launched the Disk Management tool where we can see the pair of 1GB partitions we just made on the Atari. We'll format the first, and the second we'll leave alone as it contains the DF2 and DF3 that we just created. Once the format is complete, we can copy over all of our floppy disk images, cartridge ROMs, and executables for use with the Side 3 loader. Back on the Atari now, we can browse through the files we copied to the FAT32 volume and mount up an ATR image in Drive 1. A really powerful feature is the ability to have multiple floppy disks, hard drives, and a cartridge mounted all at the same time. This screen shows all the currently connected devices. Software can access any of them, so for example, a productivity application, debugger, or development tool running from a cartridge ROM can read and write to the floppy or hard drive. Let's take a look at the contents of the ATR image we mounted on D1. The lsdisk command shows all the available devices that are currently connected. Here, I'll perform a recursive copy of the floppy contents over to the D2 boot partition. The image contains some tools and drivers for use with the Side 3. Using this method, we can populate any software we want into our Atari hard disks, but there's another method we'll look at in a second. Okay, all our files are copied over. What else can we do with this thing? Well, let's launch into BASIC from the command prompt and type in a quick 10-print program. Now, let's save it to our hard drive. How awesome is that? Cool! So far so good, but there's another way we can copy data back and forth to our Atari native hard drives. Back on the PC, I'm going to carve out another partition on the SD card, this time a small FAT16 volume of 10 megabytes. Into this partition, I'm going to copy some files I downloaded from the internet. In SDX, I'll need to add the FAT16 driver to my config.sys. The driver was part of the ATR image I copied over to my D2 boot partition. Performing this task with the SDX visual editor couldn't be easier. With the driver loaded, there's one last step, and that's to once again use the fdisk tool to add the FAT16 volume to our partition table. Instead of creating a new volume, we'll just add the existing external one and assign it to drive 4. Nice. Now we can copy whatever we want straight to our Atari native drives using the SD card without having to worry about disk images at all. It's time for the lightning round of other neat features offered up by this dynamic duo of upgrades. First, digital audio playback at 44 kHz. Next, multi-disc ATR support. Enabling this feature allows us to cycle through floppy images with the push of a button on the back of the side 3. We can also set up a swap file that enumerates each disk image to mount so we don't have to tag them manually each time. Rudimentary full-motion video is also possible using the 1 MB of available RAM. FJC has recently discussed the possibility of a proper interleaved audio-video format for the system, so we'll have to wait and see what new developments the future may hold there. This is the graphical OS for the Atari. What's shown here is just a tech demo, but the real work in progress is available to be loaded into the Ultimate's firmware if you so choose. The OS will feature a preemptive multitasking kernel with FAT32 support, a Macintosh-like interface, drag and drop support, and much more. Support for both Atari ST and Amiga mice is already implemented. Perhaps this is something we can look at more in depth in a future video. Before we wrap things up, a number of viewers commented that the double-sided foam tape I used last time would be very hard to remove in the future. So I took your advice and swapped it out for some adhesive hook and loop instead. The result isn't quite as rigid as before, but it's secure enough and should be a lot easier to remove several years down the road. A few last thoughts about the Ultimate 1 MB and Side 3 cartridge. First, a disclaimer. This was not an exhaustive review of all the features, but hopefully it was enough to give you an idea of what the devices can be used for. There are simply too many things to show in a single video, but if you're interested in a more in-depth look at the capabilities, do check out Flash Jazzcat's YouTube channel. A link is provided in the description. As a complete novice to the Atari, the number of features offered by these devices can be intimidating at first. The documentation is thorough and getting better, but the inherent complexity means you won't get the most out of the upgrades without doing some reading first. All in all, I will say that these are both fantastic products, and when paired together, they really do live up to the ultimate name. For the average user, they provide everything you'd ever likely need. For the expert user or software developer, the advanced capabilities are a dream come true. Further, the products are under constant development, and new powerful features are available in a just-released beta version that came out during production of this video. If you've got an Atari XL or XE system and don't mind doing a little soldering, this pair of devices is definitely on my recommended list. So thanks both to Candle and FJC for bringing us these amazing upgrades. Well, it's long past time that I packaged this Atari up and sent it home to its owner. I'm sure he's eager to get it back. I hope you enjoyed this bit. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Retro Bits. Hey, congratulations! You're in the 25% of viewers who made it to the end of the video. Since you're still here, please consider giving this video a like or leaving a comment. Did you know that 75% of all RetroBits viewers are not subscribers? Of course, there's Patreon if you're looking to help support the channel, but by far the most impactful thing you can do to help RetroBits grow is to share this video with a friend. Thanks for watching.